Welcome to the Understanding Boys podcast. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is recorded, the Boonwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We pay respects to leaders past, present and emerging. The Understanding Boys podcast is a series of conversations exploring what it is to be a good man these days. So if you had a story about being a good man and that you could tell a 14-year-old boy and he'd actually listen, what would that story be? And that's really what I'm asking our guests today. I'm Dr. Ray Swan, and we're a community of teachers and parents concerned with the education and growth of boys in the modern world. The series is brought to you by Brighton Grammar, an all-boys school in Melbourne. To learn more about the podcast, please visit understandingboys.com.au. Welcome to the Understanding Boys podcast. Today's show, we interview Megan de Beyer. Megan is a psychologist, parenting expert and mindfulness coach. She's currently based in Cape Town, South Africa, but she travels across the globe promoting positive parenting through her parent workshops, enabling parents to successfully navigate the challenging teenage years. She has a particular focus on boys, and her strategies are designed to empower parents through understanding, with the aim of developing their sons into strong and caring men. In today's podcast, we talk with Megan about one of her main workshops, Strong Mothers, Strong Sons. And then, in turn, we talk about the vital roles that mothers play. And finally, how to have those tricky conversations with your boys. I hope you enjoy today's podcast. Well, hello, Megan, and welcome to the Understanding Boys podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show.
Oh, I'm delighted to be here, Ray, and really great to talk to you again.
It sounds like you've been very busy. We were just chatting just before we pressed record about your new book that's coming out, Raising a Man, A Mother's Guide, which sounds like a pretty essential book for everyone to have. When do you anticipate that might be available?
It's been taken up by Penguin, and they say that the launch date is January. So this year has been very much about a really tight edit with Penguin. So it's turned very much into a book of information that covers all the big issues for mothers raising a teenage boy. But there are lots of worksheets. So I'm hoping moms will find this book very useful as a kind of tool, a guide, and a workbook.
Brilliant. And I also wanted to ask you how things are over in Cape Town. The last time we spoke earlier this year, I think you're still in drought, heading towards day zero for water. The media over here has gone very quiet about all of that. What's been happening?
Yes, what's great is we've had good rains this winter because we get our rains in winter. So we've had good rains. The dams are full. The pendulum did not swing. So I'm told that, we could return to drought anytime. So, but at least we can turn on our taps and we can have water and we can have a shower. But it's certainly been amazing for families in the way they've kind of teamed up together to make sense of the water issue. And I mean, it's been a great thing for families to visit because they've been able to talk about environmental issues really easily. And the importance of water, the simplistic notion of
it's one of the basics, isn't it? Absolutely. And it's interesting. Again, it's quite topical for the listeners when they listen to this. It'll be a little while older now, but obviously, Greta Thunberg at the the World Economic Forum, bringing and raising a culture of awareness around climate issues. And we had one of our guests earlier in the podcast was talking to that, and I imagine. In Cape Town, where you're really looking at something and had been so close to running out of water. When we spoke last time, it as another very dry continent in Australia, it must have a big impact on the culture. And it's so pleasing to hear that, families are actually able to bond and problem solve and start to innovate and think of new ways of being a little bit more environmentally aware.
Yes, exactly. It was a great opportunity and a huge wake-up call for people to understand that these natural resources have a limit.
So for today, Megan, I thought, we'd jump into your work. Obviously, as a psychologist, you work a lot with families. You work a lot with teens. And I know that, you've got a Keen to get your thoughts around your program, Strong Mothers, Strong Sons, which I've only heard really positive things about. And I also just wanted to add a caveat to our conversation today, because I think when we talk about the roles of mothers and sons and the way boys are and behave and so on, that we'll most likely run into some stereotypes pretty early on. And I guess what I'd say to that, and hopefully for our listeners as well, is that we'll do our best to negotiate the stereotypes. We acknowledge that, a better rule is probably that one size fits one, not all, that sometimes our lives do fit a type, and that does occur with some frequency. So we'll be mindful of the stereotypes, but where we need to, we'll have to sort of put them there to sort of unpack and perhaps challenge in our conversation today. So I was hoping perhaps we could start with a little bit about your current work, Megan, and what you're experiencing as a parent educator of boys in particular.
Ray, that's a really big one, because I started these workshops 10, 12 years ago. And the changes that I've seen, particularly in Cape Town, and I saw it recently in the UK, is that it's kind of the teenage issues and the problems around boys have really intensified. Families, I've seen and heard a lot of stories about parents being actually scared of their teenage boys.
Right.
And there's this sense of kind of rise in rudeness, aggression, speaking back, doing their own thing, a rise in problems around meaninglessness, not seeing any purpose, difficulties with this suicide ideation, suicide speak, and then, of course, sadly enough, suicide acts. So I wasn't seeing it like I'm seeing it today, 10 years ago, and I'm almost kind of sometimes at a loss of what to say to parents who write to me and say, I'm actually scared of my teenage boy, or I'm worried about what he's saying, what he's thinking. I'm worried what he's seeing on the internet. I'm worried about the aggressive games he's playing. So that for me has kind of really upped the intensity. And I'm not saying all families are experiencing this. There again is that kind of stuck place. But I have seen a rise in more intense issues for parents, and particularly for moms. And that really breaks my heart.
So there's a couple of things there, Megan, isn't there, at least? I mean, what you're saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, is that on the one hand, there's a rise in the intensity around some of these issues, and you sort of spoke to, some of the key areas that I know a lot of us parents, are concerned about in terms of, next step and suicidal ideation and that sense of loss of really that, a bit of direction, and sort of a directionless that seems to be permeating the culture a little bit. But at the same time, the other thing that I really heard you say then was about this fear around talking to the son. Tell me a little bit more about how you're experiencing that. I mean, that's something that I sense, but I haven't heard a lot of. But again, as a teacher and a parent, I don't share the kinds of experiences you have as a psych. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the difficulty is you need to understand that I am talking from South Africa at the moment, and our culture presently has been a culture of corruption. So we've seen a lot of corruption at different levels in society, right up to government level. And right now, there is a positivity again about tackling this. But what's happened is it's kind of filtered down. So in South Africa, we're seeing schools where there's violence, there's aggression, there's teachers being scared to teach, there's girls being kind of bullied and harassed, and boys fighting with each other, and then going home and fighting with their parents. I am not in the thick of that. It's not the work that I do. our work sort of enriching families, families' homes around issues of bonding and togetherness and finding ways to work as a team and enjoy yourself. So I'm not in the thick of it, but I'm receiving that information because I belong and began a Facebook group that went completely bananas. I mean, it's up to like 35,000 members, and those are mainly mothers with teenage boys. So I'm getting a lot of street speak. I'm hearing a lot about what's going on in homes and out there and what moms are worried about. Yeah. So that is why I'm ringing this bell. I'm alarmed at this issue of being fearful of really rude boys who want to pick a fight. But I'm not personally dealing with that, so I don't really have the answers to it, and that's probably why I'm sounding so exasperated about it, because it breaks my heart to think that this is going on in homes here in South Africa and what to do about it. But I think that it's a cultural thing, it's a societal thing, and it's something that government is also going to have to tackle. But in saying that, I mean, we have seen horrific acts of violence by young men around the world. And so much so that, we've got that book that's just been launched in America by Warren Fennell called Boys in Crisis. Yeah. And I read it quite eagerly, and he's kind of reporting, yes, boys are in crisis, and what's it about? And there's this kind of aggressive acting out that may not be everywhere, but it's certainly happening around the world.
I think you're right, Megan. And, as you were speaking and I was listening to you talk about those structures, the sort of societal structures that perhaps once that we took for granted that kind of gave us a sense of order. And, they do need to be challenged, and the power that's embodied within those structures does need to evolve and change. And I think as part of that evolution and change process, sometimes, some of the stability that might have been there is also lost, and there is, again, potentially a bit of a sense of loss as to who to turn to or who places the boundaries, or how do we manage that, the challenge around being, relational and in partnership, in dialogue and in collaboration with young men, but also, holding the line on things and sort of being a beacon and saying, hey, listen, that's actually not right. Like you just can't treat people like that. And we know clearly, particularly in Australia, people talk a lot about, where things start in terms of, domestic violence and objectification and the like. And it's, we need to be sending very clear messages to our young men today about those things, about boundaries, about what's appropriate and what's not appropriate. And there does need to be a reinvigoration, I think, of some of those things. And hopefully some of these conversations that we're having will also, empower parents to, to come back to that sort of sense of inner fortitude that means, hang on, this isn't right. I do have to muscle up and put something in place here.
Yes, I love what you're saying, Ray, and it's kind of narrowing it down now is one of the big aspects of my work is that I do look at families as systems. And it's really important for families to recognize that, firstly, their son is growing up in a family system. And every aspect of that family system is affecting and impacting his development, and his behavior is sometimes playing into the dynamics in the family. And we often find that parents don't open to the system's way of thinking. They want to zero into my son as being, kind of obnoxious and rude and, out of hand, and point fingers directly at my son without stepping back and looking at the system of the family. And then you've rightly said, the system of the family is nestled into the school system, the cultural system, and the wider society. And there are all those influences that are affecting behavior. So as a psychologist, it's often hard to say exactly why this boy is being rude. You cannot just simply say it's a character problem. It's one has to see the influences, and you started to highlight those influences around, what boys are involved in their media and their social media and their gaming, and what messages are coming through there that are kind of feeding his behavior.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, and I'm getting a bit more of a sense of it now, the title of the workshop, Strong Mothers, Strong Sons. I had two questions about that. The first one was just to maybe tell us a little bit about the origin of where it came from. I know you're a parent, and we're all learning, right? In terms of being a mum yourself of boys, and I guess firstly, where did the parent workshop start? And tell us a bit more about this idea of strong mothers, strong sons. Why is it important to be strong?
So this is it makes me smile because it takes me back, and every mother and my sons are now grown boys. So every mother of a boy who's left home, just always just smiles when they remember having their boys at home.
Yeah.
So it's the same for me. My heart just melts when you take me back to the memory of where that started. So they were teenage boys, and they 1 year apart, and they had begun to really bicker, tune. I don't know if you use the word tune, where they tune each other, which means put each other down verbally.
Okay. Yeah, we don't use that over here. I like it though, tune, okay, yeah.
Tune each other, yeah. And bicker with each other and go at each other. And then every now and then it would result in actual physical fighting, where they'd go too hard at their kind of wrestling games, and then the next minute one of them's crying, and they're about 12, 13 at this stage. And I, at that point, was a single mom. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, what happened to my sweet boys? Yeah. What happened to those boys that were kind of cuddly and kind and arms around each other and loving mom and listening and contributing, and there was suddenly this almost change of personality, and I was so confused. And it sounds weird, because at that stage I was a psychologist doing self-development work for adults, so I wasn't steeped in this development of masculinity. I didn't even know how testosterone worked and what it was. I was a psychologist who was kind of working with deep psychodynamic growth work with adult patients, and I just didn't know about this stuff. And so hence, like all moms, good moms, end up in the car park at school chatting, and I'm chatting to other moms in the same position, and they're all saying, "Oh my word, I'm so pleased you raised that. This is insane. I don't know what to do." There's almost like I have a new character in my home. There's a new personality arising out of my son, now that he's 13 and going through this growth spurt. And the one mom said to me, "Yes, and they smell." And I said, "Yes, what is that?" I keep saying, "Haven't you showered?" And we began to sort of, just through our own conversations, realize that there were changes going on that we were not educated and we were not informed about. No one had told us, and we didn't know what to do. There were also moms who felt hurt and sore and were becoming overreactive. So they weren't recognizing that their sons were kind of really pushing them away by saying, don't come to the rugby match, or why are you wearing that dress? And there were things that our sons were suddenly saying to each other, to each of us moms, that were sort of quite critical. And at that point, I realized I needed to understand, and being a good academic and a good psychologist, I found every possible book I could find on not only adolescence, but also masculinity, and this sort of unfolding of masculinity, and what turns a boy from this beautiful 8-10-year-old who's just like cuddling you, watching a movie together and saying, mommy, I want to marry you, and you're like, it's so satisfied that you've raised this Renaissance boy,
I have no recollection of that in my life, Megan, I'd say that.
And then suddenly it just turns, and there's this kind of boisterous, wild, kind of rude, obnoxious, fighting boy, and this, what I'm talking about is not violent fighting. It's that kind of really hectic, boisterous play that turns into something sort of a little more aggressive. And so with that, I got together with a male psychologist, and we did lots of workshopping together, talking, and I launched the first workshop. And the reason why I called it Strong Mothers, Strong Sons is that I discovered quite early after my divorce and having 2 boys that I needed to claim my position as mother.
Yeah.
And that without, I know this is also going to sound terribly stereotypical, but without that male role model in the home, I felt that my boys needed me to take a kind of a clearer stand and be much clearer on my boundaries, my instructions, clearer about my values, what I stood for. And it was almost like they were calling me into that. And
Right.
I found the kind of masculinity in me. And I'm only using these words now because now I understand what was going on with me. At the time, I didn't. I just thought, goodness, I'm turning into a stricter person. What's going on? But in a way, my boys were calling for much clearer guidelines. And I think boys do that generally, that they want to be quite clear about the parameters. And I suppose teenagers, generally, boys and girls, would probably do better with very clear boundaries about what's acceptable to the family and what's not. But particularly boys like to know the rules of the game, in inverted commas. And they do tend to juggle into hierarchies. And I know that bothers us because we're kind of saying, well, should there be hierarchies? But they do tend to want that sense of, I'm older than my brother, I should have more privileges, and they're asking for this. So I found it being called from me to step up and be clearer about my intentions as a mother in the home. So I brought that to the workshop, and I called it Strong Mums, Strong Sons because it was a great title. And I was referring to mothers finding their empowerment and not just leaving that over to dad. Mothers finding the way to set the boundaries, the limits, the curfews, the values, the guidance, the morals, that mothers finding that within themselves. Because adolescents needs that, boys need that. And so it was this kind of word for me, I am your mother. We use those words as mothers because I'm your mother. And we use those words quite naturally, but then what does that mean? So in the workshops, I really tell moms, you were a prep school mom. It was very clear when your son was in junior school what you had to do, because most of the time you were doing the chores, cleaning up, running after them, making sure they had their togs for sport. You were attending all the class parent meetings, etc., etc. And then suddenly there's senior school, there's high school, there's college, and moms, the mothering has to grow up with their son. And moms, and certainly when I launched the workshop, didn't recognize that they that their role of just nurturer, being available, was not enough. Moms needed to empower themselves as well, to step up, to meet this phase of male adolescence, and to meet it with an empowered approach where moms felt that they could stand tall in what they believed in and what they stood for and what their preference were, and not just give in to this growing male who was now trying to practice his assertiveness, because growing males practice their assertiveness on mothers, and mothers can get pushed around in that process, especially single moms. And if in intact families with moms and dads, if dad is not, or the other partner isn't stepping in closer to support the mother, it sometimes can leave moms feeling disempowered. So my course is very much about how to empower, step into the mother role in a very effective way for teenage boys, and then at the same time encourage your son in his masculinity. So the word strong son was really about a boy discovering a strong belief in who he is. And that's how I use the word strong. Not about this boisterous boy, who's being aggressive out there. It's about being strong within himself.
I just wanted to take you back, Megan, to the example that you gave earlier about, mother as nurturer and then that changing role. And I mean, I get that trajectory. I imagine in your workshops that you would also have a lot of mums who are single mums who have been provider, breadwinner, in that sort of role as well. And what do you sort of see as a trajectory that they come in from, where they're already perhaps more in a boundary setting, assertive role within the family dynamic, perhaps, as I say, in that role where they're already in that, and then they're coming to meet the adolescents. What's your experience or advice for those sorts of mums?
Course, excuse me if I was breaking into stereotypes there, but of course.
No, I think it's just that thing we're going to run into, for sure.
Most of my moms on the workshop are working moms, and if not the breadwinners, then they're certainly contributing, to the security of their homes. And what I would like to offer there is that I've often seen moms swing the pendulum and become quite strong in their own masculinity and their own ways, and try and enforce it in too stricter disciplinarian, and let's call it authoritarian way, with that kind of top-down approach, that it's kind of everything's focused on the don't do that, no, what are you up to, I didn't raise you to be like that, you're so lazy, you're so stupid, all that kind of really derogatory, lousy way of handling a boy, with that kind of top-down approach of just trying to stop him from any behavior that's kind of too loud or too out there. And I find that quite interesting with a lot of moms, is that in order to be strong and to kind of feel that they need to direct their son into better behavior, they tend to over-exaggerate their masculinity.
Right.
And that's also an issue in my workshops, because it's how do moms then find the balance between being empowered in what they believe and being effective in their parenting for a boy by being much clearer around their values, their morals, their beliefs, their intentions, but not resort to also being an aggressive or yelling or too authoritarian approach. So it's finding that sweet spot, that beautiful balance between allowing your femininity and allowing your grace, your tenderness, your love, your openness to remain there, because keep reminding moms, in a boy's life, especially if he ends up at an all-boys school or with a gang of boys that he hangs out with, it's quite competitive. It's very conditional, very conditional. He needs to show his talents, show his strengths. He needs to be able to show what he's good at. He needs to find his kind of ranking in that group. And that tussling for finding his own kind of personal power is quite conditional. Boys are kind of judged for their performance. And that is still happening, no matter what we say about softening our approach towards our expectations of boys being the man. There's still an expectation that he needs to achieve and he needs to perform. And I remind moms that mothers are so essential to the soft touch. They're so essential for the unconditional love and regard that boys receive in their life. I've often found, even with my dads who are great nurturers, who are just beautiful male role models of nurturance and empathy, they still can focus on what are your grades, how you're doing at sports, did you beat that guy? They can still focus on this kind of conditions around that. All right, the message is you got to do well. You got to get something done. You got to show what you're made of. You're still getting those messages coming through in homes, and mothers are key to just loving a boy for who he is. And if moms become too strong in their masculinity, in this attempt to set these boundaries and limits, they forget their femininity, their soft nurturing side, which is key and essential for a boy. And I genuinely believe, I have not seen this written, Ray, but it's what my experience is, is that a boy, to grow towards his maleness, his adult masculinity, he needs the love and protection and nurture and soft kindness of an empowered woman. He needs that. He seems to grow from the mother's love and nurturance into the male world, but he keeps returning to that mother to check in. And if we can get that
absolutely
relationship right.
Yeah, absolutely right, Megan. It's I think one of the things that you speak to that I have seen written is that, mums can provide, again, we talk about the societal determinants that, typically, for males growing up, they're in the man box and it's competitive behaviours and isolation. But one thing I have seen written that speaks a lot, I think, to what you're saying is the role that mothers can play in helping to provide maps or schemas or examples of, I guess, for want of a better expression, emotional literacy. Navigating the great sort of fortuna of our inner storming that can rage during the adolescent time as young men and males. That mums can really help navigate that and put some words and some, as I say, some schemas or maps around how to dialogue, with that sort of inner emotional landscape that perhaps for, again, societal reasons or otherwise, that maybe the dad hasn't had. He might have, but he may not have, and it's probably a pretty good chance. And certainly the research evidence would suggest that he's a hell of a lot less likely to have had that experience in his own life to be able to then connect that into the boy's life, and so the boy can start to learn that language and to speak those words and phrases and without trying to sound too poetic about it, to sort of get in touch with his inner muse. Possibly.
Yes, his inner muse, because there are those mythological stories. For instance, not Fisherman. What's the story I'm thinking of? Or even the Night Gawain. There's that beautiful story of having to go right in. What is my soul saying? What is the depth of my soul? How do I express that as a man and bring that into the world? And that really requires high emotional literacy. And I think a mother can help a boy to stay connected to that, so that he doesn't lose his heart. But, in saying that, part of my course is the mother giving the heart back to their son. Now that moms don't understand.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a huge step. And of course, you offer those rites of passage, for the boys with their dads, where there's a kind of better understanding that there has to be this kind of rite of passage where a boy has got to take a stand within his own skin, on his own 2 feet, and begin to know who he is. But part of that process is the mother giving his heart back. Because as moms, we can love our sons so deeply, so powerfully, so completely, that we kind of want to keep our sons for ourselves it's almost a kind of energetic, unspoken, unconscious level where we feel the love so fervently that we don't want to lose it. So this idea of our sons going on to meet a partner, whether it's, to meet another boy or to meet another girl, and to go on and fall in love, that can also be a really difficult transition for some moms. And I cannot tell you how many moms I've heard, and this is all over the world, not just South Africa. I've heard moms say, no girl is going to have my son, and I just about, I can't breathe, when I hear that, because it's like, what? Have you any idea of what you're saying, And there's this need that a mom has to energetically, as well as consciously, make the shift when this boy begins to grow and is ready to explore his relationships and more intimate relationships outside of the family, that she is able to stand by but give him his heart back. And I don't know how else to say that, because it's some kind of...
Well, sounds like something worth exploring in greater depth, and we'll have to make sure that the listeners are able to jump into that, particularly when the workshops become available again over here in Australia. I wanted to, just as we sort of head round the final bend towards closing, there's a few other things I wanted to touch base on. One of them was just about the broader idea of tricky issues and how to raise them with your son. And we haven't really spoken about this with our guests so far. There's a few tricky issues, whether it's about drug use or safe sexual practice and so on. One of the harder ones that I wanted to ask you about was actually about boys and pornography. We know something like 90% of boys are exposed to pornography before the age of 18, and it happens at a time when the brain is developing, it's highly plastic, and we know that pornography obviously devalues a sense of commitment. It objectifies, men, but particularly women. I'm just interested in your thoughts about how do mums, how do they talk to their sons about something like that? Do you have any advice?
Yes. So what can mums say? They need to know and stop the attitude of, well, they need to know their son will be watching porn. That's the first thing. The second thing is they can't have this attitude of not my son. The third thing, they need to give boys the facts, and they need to be armed with those facts. So as you say, what are the stats? What's going on? What is the impact? What is the impact on the brain? And then, of course, the filter systems. We need to have filter systems in the homes around computers and devices. But we then come into that tricky area of privacy again. How much privacy do we allow our boys? And that's why I keep saying to my mother's groups, mentor, don't monitor. Be a mentor. But also come clean with yourself and be self-aware. What is your attitude towards sex? What is your attitude towards porn? What are your beliefs? And you can't just take this, not in my home. You can't just take that attitude, because so maybe it's not happening in your home, but don't think your boy isn't watching it somewhere else. So we need those conversations, and we need them desperately. And I think, Ray, we need them in a wider platform, because the parents are going to find it so difficult to have this conversation at home. then should we not be having these dialogues and workshopping it in a broader way? Because I don't know if we even know the future impact of porn on our society. I mean, do we? What's your knowledge there?
No, I think you're right. And I think the other thing to consider here is just the pressure that's now on other organisations like schools to be able to provide, so much more of the information, partly I think because, parents are time poor and, there's always that thing, isn't there, about how much time do we have to unpack conversations that are complex, conversations that are a bit loaded and, possibly, require both planning as well as self-examination. They're sort of the real conversations that we need to have as parents. And, I think a lot of what you said is really, really fantastic advice. But in answer to the question, I think we don't know. But what we do know, I think, is a lot of the stats that you've already referred to about, changes to sexuality, changes to sexual practice. And we're only at the very tip of the iceberg, I think, with some of those things, which is a very sobering thought indeed. I just wanted to take us just to our last two questions. It's been such an amazing conversation, and they're probably just quite broad brushstroke questions. And the first one is just, what do you think it is to be a good man these days?
Top of my list are three things. To be a good man, you've got to not only grow up, you've got to show up, and then you eventually have got to wake up. Now, let me quickly unpack that slightly. The growing up is that understanding of moving to own your own agency, having this attitude of I can, developing your own confidence, being clear of your goals, your purpose, and the steps to achieve your goals. So that's part of growing up. But showing up is that contributory side, that contributory sharing side, and that requires emotional literacy. Mm-hmm. So being able to know your feelings, verbalize them, speak up, but show up. Show up means stand up for those issues that you see happening. If there's bullying happening, say something. If there's harassment towards a girl or woman, speak up, say it. Show up for your parents, show up for your friends. Be that person that knows what they believe in and say it. But then the wake up, Ray, is that soulful aspect. It's the soulful spiritual side. It's that who am I in the deep, in the bigger, wider scheme of things? Who am I at my deep core? What is it that I deeply believe in and care about? What is it that I love? And how am I going to bring that love forward? And that requires, the wake-up part requires deep contemplation, inner searching, quiet time. And I think the wake-up is something that continues right into our later adult years. So the wake-up is a much longer process. But I think teenage boys can learn the growing up and the showing up at least by the time they leave school.
Wonderful. And that's I love it. I love the waking up. It fits with the whole, what's the word now? Being woke, I suppose.
Yes.
But I know it's different to that. But and I like it as well because I think it's about, if you think about, being connected, being related to others, having a sense of why, and as you were saying, being responsible for who you are and the impact that you could potentially have in the community and for others. I think all those things are so true, aren't they? And they're repeated patterns that we see in so many of the stories and also have been shared by so many of the guests. So Megan,
Ray, do you know that you are incredible at taking information and and saying it in these short, succinct, really clear sentences. Thank you so much for taking what I said and translating it. So I say yes. Just listen to Ray. That's
I think we need to edit this whole bit out, Megan. Actually, my last question to you is the story or advice. Either is fine, and different guests have done both. But if you did have a piece of advice or a story for a 14-year-old and he'd listen, what would that be?
So for a 14-year-old, I would advise him to begin to listen to his inner voice and his inner promptings. I would advise him to listen first to that, and how to listen to it means that you do need some time on your own, and you need some time possibly journaling. You need some time reading and thinking about who you are on the inside, and a 14-year-old can absolutely start that process. And I would advise him not only to listen to his friends and what his friends are saying it is to be a cool person. I think, Ray, that would be my best advice. Is a 14-year-old needs to begin the process of contemplation and listening to his inner voice and keep going inside to get a sense of who he is. He could start learning his body, his own body sensing language on the inside. And I'd highly recommend that. He might need help with that, but if we could get a 14-year-old really listening inwards first before he listens to just what his mates are saying, that would be really important.
Megan, that's such sage advice, as has your whole conversation today, full of wisdom, experience. I think, having experienced so much of this firsthand as a parent and, as a learner, and then, really taking lots of those experiences, framing them in what's the best knowledge out there, and then translating that into programs and ultimately a book, that can be a great guide for all the amazing mums out there. And, I'm hopefully going to get my mum to tune into this one as well. Might be a bit late. But, just from all of us here at Understanding Boys, thank you again for your time. And we're looking forward to, to seeing you out in Australia a little bit later in 2019.
Yes, I'm so looking forward to that. I so enjoy being at your school. It's so advanced in its thinking around wellness, and I love that.
Well, we hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Understanding Boys podcast. Make sure you subscribe on your podcast app, and please leave us a review to help grow the community. For more information about the podcast, visit understandingboys.com.au. Until next time, thanks for listening.